at literally the very last minute. I mean, we're talking day 100 of a session that was only supposed to be 60 days. Republican lawmakers in Florida just unveiled a potentially massive expansion of a public school privatization program. We're going to tell you more about it in just a sec. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. Well, we made it. Today is day 100 of the Florida Legislature's 60-day legislative session. This is a benchmark I have never seen in my 20-some-odd years of doing this, a legislative session making it to triple-digit days. I'm recording this on June 11th during a session that was supposed to have ended May 2nd, but has been essentially stuck in a month-long purgatory amid an ongoing budget stalemate between Republicans in the House, Republicans in the Senate, and Republican Governor Ron DeSantis. Now, they are making progress finally. We are getting very close to bringing this in for a landing. In fact, it looked for a time like they might even have a final budget deal by the end of yesterday, day 99. That did not happen. This, it seems like nothing this session is going to come easy. It's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, all the way to the end here. But they are getting close. I think at this point, if memory serves, the House and Senate have both agreed to extend session through June 18th. So that's a week from today. That's kind of like the drop dead deadline at this point. You know, if they don't pass something by then, the session expires and everything collapses and you're looking at like a real mess to try and get something done in time for the start of the new budget year. So things may drift for at least a few more days if they don't get it together immediately, but it does feel like they are going to make that June 18th deadline at the very latest. Now, that said, a bunch of important stuff is happening right now, including the House of Representatives yesterday, out of the blue, rolled out a potentially massive expansion of this controversial charter school program. Charter schools are essentially privatized public schools. They're publicly funded schools that are run by private companies and private operators. And this was an issue that was supposed to have been dead, and it has just been sort of resurrected from the grave at the very last minute here in Tallahassee. And what I mean by that is, so like I said, the session was supposed to last only 60 days. And when it became clear that they weren't going to be able to get a budget deal done by day 60, they struck this agreement to extend the session to work on the budget. But the deal was supposed to be that it was going to be budget only, right? The budget only and a handful of things directly related to the budget. Any sort of major policy bills that weren't sort of passed by day 60 were supposed to be dead for the year. And this Schools of Hope charter school stuff that we're going to be talking a bit more about, that was an issue during session. I think we've even mentioned on this podcast, the House and Senate had been sort of pinballing a couple of bills that would have expanded the program pretty significantly. And then on day 60, literally, like, I think it was 7 or 8 p.m. on the night of day 60, like as late as you can get in this thing, the House out of the blue unveiled this potentially massive expansion that nobody had seen before, kicked it over the Senate, and this kind of like Hail Mary to pass that. It did not pass. By the time sort of the bell rung on day 60, that was supposed to be the end of it. But here we are, the House bringing it back from the dead once again at the 11th hour. And this illustrates one of the really sort of dangerous things about the way the legislature does the budget. There is a long history in Florida of using the budget as essentially a Trojan horse for major policy issues. There are, if you really want to nerd out, every budget, there's like a handful of what are often called budget conforming bills. And they're essentially meant to just like, they exist to like tweak state statutes, state laws to conform with the funding decisions they're making in the budget. But what we have is leadership will often stuff major controversial things into those budget conforming bills, and it's a horrible way to do this for a couple of reasons. The first is the budget is the least transparent process in Tallahassee, a place that is not well known for transparency in the first place. Budget decisions get made almost entirely behind closed doors and almost entirely by leadership. And so, just to give you an example of what I mean by that, so there was one budget meeting yesterday in Tallahassee, and what this budget meeting is just the chair of the appropriations committees in the House and Senate just showing up and handing each other a couple of spreadsheets and gaveling out. The whole thing lasts like 2 minutes long, and that's it, right? No discussion. None of the debate happens behind public. Certainly, none of the decisions happen in public. This is all being done behind closed doors, which limits the opportunity for people to obviously influence the process, to provide feedback on stuff. And the other part of this is when you do stuff through the budget. One of the sort of the key wrinkles here is once budget negotiations are done, that's it. You can't amend the budget. Again, that might sound boring, but like when you think about it, there is a long history in politics all over the place of log rolling. Essentially, take three or four really popular bipartisan things, and you lump them together with like a couple of really ugly partisan or corporate giveaway type things, and you force people to vote on it all as one package, right? This is what they do. This is why budget votes are so hard, are so tough sometimes, because there's in any given budget, there's going to be a bunch of stuff you disagree with, it doesn't do, or it funds that you don't want. Like, think of a couple of years ago when the legislature was giving Ron DeSantis a bunch of money to go kidnap migrants in Texas. Well, technically, they gave him money to kidnap migrants in Florida, and the governor used to kidnap migrants in Texas instead. But that's a horrible thing. But the budget might also include pay raise for teachers and stuff like that. And so if you're not part of the leadership team making the decisions, you're faced with potentially tough votes trying to balance that sort of thing. And the same thing happens when you do policy this way. When you stick stuff into these budget conforming bills, you lose the opportunity not only to have public debate about stuff, but to try and make changes. Because once this stuff comes out of once the white smoke starts coming out of the speaker's office and the Senate president's office, this stuff can't be changed. The cake is baked and it's an up or down thing on it, right? And especially when you're dealing with like school privatization stuff, which is obviously a very partisan issue, but like there are plenty of moderate Republicans who are somewhat queasy with like outsourcing public schools. But they're not going to get any chance to sort of moderate whatever comes out of this. So this is not new. It has always been a gross way to do policy. It is just especially disappointing to see it happening in this session when there seemed to be genuine agreement that this extended session was just going to be budget, and that anything that wasn't any policy bills that weren't resolved by day 60 were not going to come back up in this extended session once we get to June. And obviously that was a lie. So let's talk a little bit more about this Schools of Hope stuff. And so first, the Schools of Hope program is essentially like a fast-tracked charter school program. Charter schools are essentially publicly funded but privately run schools, essentially like privatized public schools is one way to think of it. And a few years ago, Richard Corcoran, when he was the House Speaker, that's the guy who went on to become somehow ran against Ron DeSantis for governor. Got if memory serves, he didn't even make it to the actual election before he dropped out. Became the governor's education commissioner, and is now the $1 million a year president of New College, where presiding over the destruction of New College of Florida. Anyway, he was like the original sort of conceiver, or at least legislative champion of the Schools of Hope program, and essentially it is a way to fast track charter school openings in areas where there are struggling schools. And so essentially if a charter school operator gets designated gets permission to open a Schools of Hope, they can go into an area where there's a struggling school and they get to open it regardless of whether or not like locals want it there, right? There's like kind of a preemption element to this. Preemption, if that term is new to you, check out our last podcast. It's an important thing to learn if you're trying to understand sort of why government doesn't work the way you want it to. But also, we end up throwing tons of taxpayer dollars and subsidies and loans at these Schools of Hope schools once they open in these areas. And it's a really controversial program because it raises all sorts of issues about like allowing these charter schools to potentially cherry pick areas and creating like really sort of like separate education systems in some of the most difficult areas of Florida, because these tend to be some of the poorest areas of Florida where you find the most struggling schools. So anyway, And the program has been somewhat slow to ramp, from my understanding. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but this is roughly accurate. There's something like the way the program works is if a public school gets like is struggling, it gets labeled a persistently low performing school, then that's where a Schools of Hope charter can sort of like swoop in and open up without like overriding local approval and getting all these like taxpayer subsidies to help stand it up. There are something like 50 schools in Florida that have been labeled persistently low performing, and there's something like I think 12 actual schools of hope around the state right now. And again, schools of hope just means it's a charter school. It's essentially an aggressively subsidized charter school. And so what the House wants to do, and I should say it's not entirely clear because sort of just circling back to just how untransparent this process is. Right now, all we know about what the House wants to do is like a couple of lines in a spreadsheet that say they're going to do this. But if you sort of like read the tea leaves, it seems to link back to that last minute massive expansion they rolled out on day 60 of session. It seems to be, if not that exact language, it seems to be something very similar. And so what that's going to do is a whole bunch of changes that have the net effect of dramatically expanding the potential number of schools of hope, the universe of students they can serve, and the areas they can set up shop. So it will, for instance, it will essentially revise the definition of what is a persistently low performing school to like catch far more schools will sort of earn this designation and then suddenly become, you know, ripe opportunities for a school of hope to set up shop. It will also lift some restrictions on which students these schools can serve. It'll allow them to serve essentially a broader population of students. It will also like lift restrictions on where geographically they can locate. They will give them a lot more latitude. They don't have to be right in these struggling neighborhoods now. They don't have to be right in the community they're serving. They could be further and further away. Yeah, which is only going to exacerbate these concerns about like who these schools are actually serving. And then there are also changes that it's going to allow like state colleges and state universities to sponsor schools of hope, which is an interesting thing when you think about all we've seen with just how much explicit partisan control and partisan takeover is happening in public universities. I mean, the new president of the University of West Florida literally worked in the charter school industry. So probably going to be a favorable audience to any sort of charter school operator that comes along looking for a blank check from him, I suspect. And then it will even essentially require school districts to allow schools of hope, these charter schools, to set up shop within existing traditional public schools. So like essentially operate from the inside. Come be like, parasite is probably too strong a word, but like come be, here's a blast from the past, come turn a public school into a host body for a privatized charter school, essentially. This is pretty wild stuff to be doing at the last minute. And what's especially significant about this is only a little bit of this was in the bills that were pinballing back and forth during session between the House and the Senate. The stuff around like some of the co-location stuff and the persistently low performing school, changing that definition. Even that alone, staff analysts, when they looked at this stuff, were like, this is going to be like a potentially major expansion of the number of places schools of hope can go. And then the House layered in all this other stuff about like opening up the student bodies they can serve, opening up the geographic areas they can go in, allowing state colleges and universities. So we've had no like kind of independent analysis of what those changes mean, how they might actually work. Because again, the first time we saw this language was on day 60 of the legislative session, 8 p.m. on day 60. And here we are now, like, it looks like trotting it back out again on June 10th on day 99 of a 60-day legislative session. So we'll obviously pay close attention. This is a really interesting issue. I don't know this to be true yet, although I have some public records requests in, some somewhat related to this. There is a lot of chatter, and there's some like anecdotal evidence, at least, to support that at least some of this is being driven by Success Academy, which is a New York charter school operator that wants to expand in Florida, and Ken Griffin, the billionaire hedge fund manager who moved to Miami and is like, I think he's Florida's second richest person and by far the biggest contributor in all of Florida politics. And I gave something like $30 million in campaign contributions during the last election, including, by the way, $4 million each to House Speaker Danny Perez and Senate President Ben Albritton. I mean, this is just enormous amounts of money. This is like way outside the sort of norm of even like the richest donors in Florida. He has become a big supporter of Success Academy, and there's a lot of at least chatter in Miami that Ken Griffin Success Academy want to set up shop in Miami. Like I said, there are lobbying records that kind of support that. There's also some of this co-location language. If you look at the Senate bill, it was initially just the Senate wanted to limit it to just Miami, so it was clear like whatever they're trying to make happen here or allow happen, they wanted to specifically allow it to happen in Miami. So we'll hopefully learn more about this and learn more about the program. We'll have more on the newsletter about it and stuff. But it is just a reminder of just how much shit happens behind closed doors and gets sprung at the last second when the Florida legislature is in town. So like you cannot end a session soon enough in Florida, man. It is you do not ever want to be in a day 100 situation. Nothing good can come of that. And just like to give you a few other examples of like stuff coming out of nowhere, just in the last couple of days, out of nowhere, the legislature has stuck like almost $60 million into its budget that appear to be for immigration related purposes that haven't actually been spelled out yet. There's literally like $53.5 million just popped up in a budget offer that all it says is domestic security, and my understanding about this, I don't know if this is right, but what I've heard is that this is potentially to help like expand jails because we're going to be throwing so many more undocumented immigrants into jail now. So I think what that money is, but we have not yet actually seen language to support that yet. But this is the kind of stuff, out of the blue. It's just sort of showing up. Here's $50 million of taxpayer money we're going to spend on immigration, and we'll tell you what it's for later when it's time to vote, essentially. Another thing, the House yesterday just popped in some language that's going to allow dental hygienists to use lasers, which is like a wild thing. Like, again, this was supposed to be a budget special session, right? Or a budget session, right? That's all we were doing. This is another bill that seemed to be dead, but now the budget includes letting dental hygienists use lasers. And to be clear, actually, I support this. Generally speaking, I support expanding scope of practice of allowing, nurses, dental hygienists, other kind of like non-doctor medical professionals to do more work, to prescribe more stuff. I think the doctors lobby is one of the biggest rent-seeking lobbies in all of politics, and that's not just in Florida, that's across states. They do so much to try and like essentially drive up the cost of their monopolized services and drive up the cost, the pay that they take home. And expanding scope of practice is a way to try and bring down is a supply side way to try and bring down some medical care costs. Now, I say this, I know nothing about dental hygienists and lasers, so I'm not some expert on the thing. But generally speaking, I think scope of practice, expanding that stuff, it falls right in with rolling back unnecessary occupational licensing stuff as far as I'm concerned. That said, not a budget issue. Should not be doing this on day 100 in a session where we said all policy was dead after day 60. It's just, again, it's a dangerous situation to be here. And so, a couple of things, like we're probably not through with this. So like there's still a big environmental budget conforming bill that is floating around out there that has not been resolved. We could see there's any manner of things that could pop up in that. We've seen the legislature in the past try and do like pro sugar and pro FPL stuff in an environmental conforming bill. So who knows what that's going to look like when that finally lands. There's also they have not settled on they call it a tax package, essentially like it's a giant piece of package of various tax breaks and stuff. They've kind of like outlined broad contours, which is, as we've talked about, they're going to give almost all of it to businesses. But every year, the legislature kind of slips in a bunch of special interest giveaways into the tax package. And so who knows what they're thinking about slipping into this thing right now. We know from the regular session that there's this gross investment company that writes these really basically repackages incentive programs and like con states into passing them and then turns around and profits off themselves. A company called Advantage Capital. It's got something in the Senate. It had something in the Senate's tax package. So who knows, that may still be in there. We know that Verizon, there's a potential tax break floating around that could literally save $20 million a year for one company, Verizon, the giant wireless company. That's floating around out there. There's a data center tax break that I know in the past Florida Power and Light has been really interested in. That's floating around out there. There's tax breaks for NASCAR and the Miami World Cup host committee, all these sorts of things. There could be a ton of little gross things that just pop up in this, but we're not going to see it until, potentially the day we vote. So, I say all this, it could all be already obsolete. Maybe for all I know, the two budget chairs have a meeting going on right now. They're handing each other more spreadsheets and we'll get some answers. But the point is, pay attention until the very end. And man, I think anybody in Florida should just be rooting for them to go home because, like I said, not a lot good happens at the very last minute of a legislative session, as we're potentially seeing right now. So I'm going to leave it there. There's a number of other interesting sort of funding decisions they've made. We'll probably go through those again soon. But one of the other sort of just gross ways this process works is the legislature over the last particularly 15 years has developed this concept called, literally, it's called the sprinkle list or the sprinkle fund, where the House and Senate hold back a bunch of money for themselves. And then once the budget is finally done, they take that pot of money, they split it, and each side gets to just decide whatever they want to do with it, right? The House Speaker and the Senate President, in some years, this is several $100 million. They just get to put it into whatever they want, essentially, and the other chamber can't object, right? It's cast as this is just a way to make sure we finally get out of here, because you can't at some point you got to stop negotiating and just make a decision. But it takes what is already a terribly secretive process and makes it even more secret. It takes what's already an incredibly top-down process, in the hands of the Speaker and the Senate President, makes it even more consolidated in their hands. And so anything right now about funding decisions, when they agree not to fund something or to fund something, it's kind of meaningless until you see those sprinkle lists, and you don't see that until the budget is done. So once we get some of those, we'll go a little bit more detail into some of the earmarks in the budget. There's obviously, as you might expect, a bunch of really interesting ones. So more to come on that front, but in the meantime, let's leave it there and let's all just root for them to go home. Please don't forget to click like and subscribe, maybe leave us a comment or a review. And then if you haven't already, please remember to sign up for the newsletter. Easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Thanks so much.